Good evening, friends, other subscribers, and if some students are listening, so welcome to all of you. So, the objectives of this video lecture is to understand the meaning of communication, the elements of communication, how to identify the process of communication, the various types of communication, and understand the ways and means in which the development of communication takes place, and also to describe the general barriers to communication. Now, I will divide this lecture into two parts. The first part will be dedicated towards understanding the objectives of communication, their meanings and concepts, what the different elements of communication are, what processes of communication are there, and the various types of communication, verbal and non-verbal, interpersonal, intrapersonal, and other types of group and mass communication. In the second part of this lecture, I will talk about the ways and means of developing the communication process and the general barriers to the communication. So stay tuned and let's delve into the lecture. Now, communication is a way in which you play a very effective role, an essential role in running any show of any formal and informal teaching learning process. Now, when I say communication, I mean to say the general development of communication with respect to the speech and language, and under certain circumstances, like you have the current online teaching method, is also a kind of a machine-based communication, internet-based communication. Now, in many ways, teaching is communicating, and this, in sense, is a hallmark of a good teacher, is that they are very good communicators. Now, education is everything to do with this kind of communication in the teaching learning process. Whether it is correlated activities of teaching and learning that involves communication, as well as in kind of a reciprocal communication process, interaction between the teacher and the student, or the teacher and the students, and as channels of realizing its objectives of mass dissemination of knowledge. Communication, therefore, plays a very, very effective and essential role for running the show of any formal and informal teaching learning process. So, in many ways, teaching is communicating, and communication is a way in which how things are put across to the student. The communication, in its literal sense, stands for the act of communicating. One can communicate one's ideas, thoughts, feelings, etc., or transfer any type of information and knowledge to the others through this act of communication. The word communis is a Latin word from where the word communication is developed, which means common. So hence communication is having a common way in which the share of experiences is put through. How we do it is basically by a widely accepted phenomenon of sharing of ideas and feelings for a kind of a mutually, in a kind of a mutually understandable manner. So I am sharing with you something, and somebody else is sharing with you something, and that this across this shared mechanism, we communicate our thoughts and feelings. But also there has to be some kind of a feedback that needs to be generated, because without that feedback your communication process is not complete. So the communication means the sharing of ideas, and also it involves interaction, and which also encourages some kind of a give and take. It provides the feedback to persons that are involved in effective communication, and therefore effective communication is a two-way process, literally including feedback as well as interaction. So in its literal sense, communication is basically a method in which ideas and thoughts and feelings, etc., are transferred, and any type of information or knowledge to the others through this act of communication. Now, what are the elements of communication? There are 10 parts to a communicational context or communicational situation. So the first one is context, which can be a physical, social, psychological, or temporal. So the physical context is the room or the hallway or the balcony or a party or a classroom or whatever situational it is there. Social relates to the status relationships and among the people that are there. Psychological relates to the formality or informality, and the temporal relates to the time or some kind of a period of time that is involved. Now, the second part is the source. So, person or an event which provides a verbal or non-verbal cues in which one can respond. Then the source is the person who generates that communication process. The third one is the receiver, one who receives and interprets the message. The fourth essential component of communication is a message, which is a set of verbal and non-verbal cues, commands, etc., that are sent by the source. It can include words, figures, gestures, movements, body language, etc., etc. Then there is something which is called the symbol, which is the fifth part of the communication process. So the symbol is something that stands for something else. Say, for example, I make a symbol with two overlapping stars, triangles to depict a star. So the star is the depicted one, and this figure that I draw through two overlapping triangles, one straight and one inverted, so that looks like a star. So the star becomes the referent. So this is how the symbol is generated. So words, for all that it matters, are symbols. They are verbal symbols. Then you have the next part, the sixth one, which is the channel. It means the kind of thing that is used to transmit the message, to convey the message. The channels are the senses of perception, your hearing, and also in the medium like air, so where you can produce this visual, auditory, the gustatory, the touch, and the olfactory mechanisms, the tactile ones that are there. So all these constitute the decoding, the channel. So then you have seventh and eighth are encoding and decoding processes. The encoding process being the using of symbols to encrypt the message, and decoding is the process by which the receiver understands and decodes the message that is received from the symbols that you have heard. So the symbolic interpretation is then converted into some kind of a meaning at the receiver end. And then you have feedback, which is an essential part of the communication process, in which the response of the receiver is communicated to the sender, and as a result, the receiver becomes the sender and the sender becomes the receiver. So in a speech situation or a communication situation, each of them, the sender receiver, are an ideal speaker hearers. So they are there, but both of them perform the other function as well. And then the last one, which is kind of not so obvious, but all communication channels has noise in it. So noise is anything apart from the message, something that distorts the message, obscures the message, or something which has the capability of kind of muting the message, kind of modulating the message in some sort of a way. It can be an external one or an internal source at the sender's end, in the receiver's end, or in the medium of or the channel through which the message is kind of transmitted. Now all these taken together forms the process of communication, and since communication is basic to all humans, their performance, their interaction, therefore it refers to the transmission of thoughts, information and commands through all these 10 processes, 10 parts to all the necessary parts of the communication system or communication network. The process of interpersonal communication is both therefore an art as well as a science. The art of communication has its roots in the principles of psychology, and the science in the use of technology for the communication process. Like, say for example, we are using this online teaching so as a method for communicating. So this becomes the use of technology, so that is the science part. And the art part is that I am describing to you the processes through by my use of words. It is therefore necessary to understand and apply the principles of both psychology and to kind of earn the way in which the practice of the audiovisual materials are to be learned. So some thought about some people who are communicating in groups can also be put, because group meetings, group discussions all form part of the communicational network, the larger communicational network, and therefore sometimes it becomes less time consuming and more communicative and result oriented. So the last topic that this part of the video is going to cover are the types of communication. So the nature, the forms and the styles of communication, we have seen in the earlier part of this video that they are very much dependent upon the nature and types of the media of the communication channels that are used by the sender and the receiver. So generally we can classify the communication in terms of the broad categories, and therefore different communication media or channels, verbal and non-verbal communication, natural and mechanical communication, form a part of the communicational mechanisms. So the different types of communication are these. So what are the verbal and non-verbal communications? So let me just give you an example of what happens when we have a verbal communication process. So language becomes the key and the base of any verbal communication process, and therefore each society develops one or the other form of language that is spoken or written in words, which becomes useful for communicating with one another. So it becomes there's a local language, there's a regional language, there's a national language, international languages for a required communication process for various tasks and functions, and therefore the use of language can take either the written form or the oral form, or oral plus written form. So sometimes in oral form the language can be used to communicate the feelings, thoughts, intentions by others. For this purpose, the sender or the communicator makes use of some very, very precise symbols and distinct sounds, which basically become the language through which the receiver receives and decodes the thought process, the thoughts and ideas and feelings that are there in the from the in the mind of the sender. On the other hand, a formal way of looking at things is when language is converted into a written form. The language communication, the sender makes use of scriptal forms. The scripts, say for example, Devanagari is used for Hindi or Marathi or Nepali. The Roman script is used for English, German, etc. Gurmukhi script is used for Punjabi, etc. These are used for the communication of thoughts and feelings, just like in the oral and verbal area, just that they are converted into some kind of written symbols through these alphabet systems. So they use pen and paper, they use the whiteboard, blackboard, or the print media, or the books, or newspapers, and something that you can read and write. And the person on the receiving side understands the meaning of the communicated message through the reading and decoding the process. The decoding process is similar as to what you encounter when you hear it, but at the same time there are certain differences, because the mechanisms, the brain mechanisms that engender the reading process are a little different from what you use to hear and decipher the message. On the other hand, opposed to this is a nonverbal communication, which basically is a process which can be through various verbal and non-verbal written communication, beyond which there is certain parts of the communication process that are there. So say for example the facial expressions, the language of the eye. So say for example you have eye contact, or the considered a very common and universal, and from all cultures and societies of the world encourage it, and actually eye-to-eye contact forms the very basis of effective communication. So in a teaching learning scenario, it becomes very, very important for the teacher to maintain the eye contact with the student. So however, we have to remember that there can be certain cultural settings in which eye contact may not be feasible. So you have to be, the teacher and the pupil both have to be aware of certain pragmatic issues about these things. Now, the other part is what many people call the body language. So our body has an impressive and effective language for communicating our feelings. So we use our hand gestures, we use our posture, we use broad categories of physical movements, and therefore that can lead to very, very important cues that generate our feelings of anxiety, fear, anger, or emotion, other kinds of emotion. So judging by the use of these kinds of body languages, it can be very effectively used by teachers for managing their students in the classroom setting for healthy interaction among all types of the teaching learning situations. Now teachers may add their own effective solutions to these body languages, and they may develop their own styles, their expositions, their demonstration skills, and the use of appropriate body language. Now, along with that, you have interpersonal, intrapersonal, and group and mass communications, where you have one-to-one communication, small group communication, large group or public communication, organizational communication, and sometimes and this can be regarded to be the precursor to all the kinds of mass communication in the range of fields and applications that are there. So most of the organizations that are there, including our universities and other offices and so any kind of organization, they use a kind of a mass communication like emails, internet, and conferencing, video conferencing, YouTubes, and satellite communication transmissions. So they are using these institutional mechanisms for individual to communicate their thoughts, feelings, and actions. So ultimately, it goes back to the same way in which the communication channel is to be taken into account, and therefore can be used effectively for distance education, or in the case of when we are using this as a tool, say for example our online teaching mechanisms. So what we are doing now is we are using these sophisticated tools of distance education, which is basically nothing but a mass media ways of looking at things. So using this mass media of say for example a podcast or a YouTube, we are going to reach out to the students because physical presence is not possible in this context. So you people are you are witness to a kind of a situation, a forced kind of a situation when the world is going through a very tough times using the because of uh, the the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic that is going on throughout the country, and so movement is very restricted. But we have our internet, we have our mass media channels, we have our communication mechanisms and communicational media that can take care of some parts in a very limited sense. It does not replace the face-to-face communication, but we can all develop mechanisms in which distance education in this mode can be very, very fruitful. So in the next video, I will be talking about ways and means of developing the communication skills, and how there are certain barriers of communication, and which are the general ones, and how to overcome them.